Hello, thank you very much. My name is Zach. I'm from the company HIS, and today I'm going to be just introducing us a lot of information about ramen and a little bit about travel in Japan as well. So I will go ahead and share my screen here so we can all enjoy the presentation. So the name that we chose for the presentation today is Ramen Explorer, and we chose that specifically because we're kind of going to use ramen as a lens to kind of learn about not only about ramen itself, but also some different areas of Japan as well. So first, just some brief information before we get into the ramen, just a little bit about our company, HIS. We are a Japanese travel agency, one of the biggest in Japan. We have over 500 branches worldwide, over half of those being in Japan, which means that, when you book your trip with us to Japan, you have a lot of support in the country. We have branches in pretty much every major city throughout literally every major city throughout the country. So, we have the best rates, the best connections, the best info and insight. So we can really help make your trip great. We have good rates on international flights to Japan, of course, hotels, as well as kind of ones that are more hard to book on online sites like Expedia, such as ryokan, which are like traditional inns, and even like Buddhist temples, kind of rare kind of places to stay like that, we can help you out with, and guides, of course, whether it be for just a private trip, just for you or just your family, or you want to organize a trip for a large group or your school, we can help you out with that. And we have offices here in the US where you can actually come in and consult with us. Or, right now, of course, with the coronavirus situation and such, everything is going to be virtual, of course. So you can also give us a call or visit us online at our website, hisgo.com. We also have a kind of blog article central website called Destination Japan, which focuses on just a lot of info about Japan. And a lot of the stuff I'm going to be showing in the presentation today actually comes from that website. So take a look if you're interested. Okay, so now jumping right into the ramen, which I know is what you all came for. So first of all, the origins. And once again, some of you might know this information already. So, if you do, just look at the pretty pictures. But origins of ramen, as you may know, originally is a Chinese dish. Has long origins going back hundreds of years in China. And in Chinese, it's called ramyeon. Excuse my pronunciation, I don't speak Chinese, so any Chinese viewers, please forgive me. The characters for it literally just mean pulled noodles, which refers to the method of production of the noodles, just kind of pulling them apart to elongate them. And the Chinese version of the dish, of course, there's a lot of variations of it, just like Japanese ramen. It would kind of look something like this, which, as you can see, is a little different than the Japanese ramen. You might be used to the soup, kind of is a different consistency. The noodles a little different, but you can also see how they kind of come from the same way. There's also some debate about which came first, whether it be this Chinese ramen. There's also a dish more on the west, like Central Asia and the western part of China, which is also called lagman. And as you can see, it also has like a similar sound to ramen, kind of evolved in a different direction, lagman. And that one looks like this. And has thicker noodles, often features lamb meat. That's another really good dish I recommend trying out if you ever get the chance. Popular in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkestan, also, like I said, the western part of China. So next, specifically, let's talk about so that's the kind of the background. So what's the history of the dish we know as ramen today as it exists in Japan? So the first instance of it being, mentioned in Japanese history goes all the way back to the Muromachi period, over 500 years ago, and it comes from the diary of a Buddhist monk who mentioned that it's a dish he learned about when he was studying Buddhism in China, and he was in Kyoto, and he mentions that he made it for a guest, and that's the first. It was actually discovered recently. The original was a story about a famous shogun ate it in the 16th century, but then recently was actually an archaeological discovery. It goes back further than that, the first instance of ramen being eaten in Japan. And there's actually a shop in Yokohama, which is the city next to Tokyo, and the name of the shop is Mitohan Ramen. And that actually recreates kind of this very ancient style of ramen that exists in Japan. And kind of the point that's different than one of the main points that's different from the modern type, as you can see in this picture, there's a big focus on these little side dishes that come out, which are in Japanese called yakumi, which means like a medicinal taste. And it's supposed to kind of give a pungent counter to the meat-based, the heavy meat flavor of the soup, because at that time in Japan, meat was not typically eaten. So there was kind of, they needed something to kind of balance out the heavy and oily meat flavors. So you can try that in Yokohama if you like. It's called Mitohan Ramen. And so it did have those origins way back hundreds of years ago. It really kind of took off and became a more common around the turn of the 20th century, around late 1800s, early 1900s. Started appearing, for example, like in Yokohama Chinatown. In Japan, there's a lot of Chinese residents, very much as introduced as a Chinese dish. However, it was really after World War II that it really started to take off and become a really popular food. And one reason for that is because there was actually a rice shortage in Japan after the war, and the U.S. sent rations of wheat. So they had all this surplus of wheat, and a lot of it was used to make noodles. And also at that time, there was a big, because like we said, until then, meat was not eaten so much in Japan, or at least not until the 19th century. But then, especially like with the U.S. occupation, they were really trying to make people eat a lot more meat. There was like a movement like, let's eat more meat, let's eat more wheat. And ramen kind of served those needs. And it really kind of took off and became like a popular, trendy, even seen as a kind of a healthy urban food. And it was often eaten in kind of little, yatai is what they're called. We'll talk more about those later. Kind of little like outside stands like this in an urban environment. This is a modern picture, but they had stuff like this in the past as well. Okay, so next, kind of went briefly over the history. Now I want to talk about just the different parts of ramen and go a little bit more in depth so that you can, when you hear about all the different types of ramen there are, some more background about what that means exactly. So the first building block of ramen is going to be the broth. The broth is kind of the base, literally, of the ramen soup. And usually it's just going to be it's going to start with some kind of bone, usually. Pork or chicken is the most common, which are boiled, depending on the style, how long they're boiled can change. For some styles, like the Hakata style in Fukuoka that we're going to talk about, can be boiled for like days to get a super rich flavor, really get the flavor off those bones. Some not so long, but in any case, there's a huge amount of attention paid to the quality of the broth. And there can be added other things as well, like garlic, ginger are common to kind of offset that heavy meat flavor and give some other flavor as well. Kind of boiled in a pot like this. And there are, variations that exist to those kind of more typical chicken bone, pork bone ones we talked about. For example, there's something called wafu, which literally just means Japanese style. And more specifically, that means that there's going to be ingredients in the broth that are more associated with typical dashi. Just means it's like the Japanese word for broth, basically. And what is kind of a typical broth in Japanese cuisine, which would be like a fish flavor. If you see wafu, it also means it'll have like some katsu in it, which is bonito, also called skipjack tuna. Niboshi, that's a word you often see when you see describing ramen. That means like these small little dried sardines. Might also have some shiitake mushrooms or kombu in there. Kombu being a type of seaweed that is often very used in Japanese style broths. So that's wafu. There's those niboshi we talked about, and that's what example of what a wafu soup would look like. It's more clear, not as heavy as some of the ones you might see elsewhere. And also beef bone broths do exist as well. There's some regions that have these as a specialty. Specifically this one here, this is from Mie-ken. And then this one you see on the right, this is from Tottori-ken. Those are two different places in Japan. Fortunately, there's so many variations of regional variations. We won't be able to talk about all of them in depth. But some of these regions do have beef bone. And you can see here, even though it's the beef bone broth, the soup looks very different. And that's because even if you use the same broth, the same stock, like how long you boil them, what kind of additional flavorings you add can end up in a very different product. And also vegetarian broths exist as well if you are vegetarian, so that's good news. Usually those are going to be kombu based, which is that seaweed that we talked about. That is going to give it a kind of rich flavor. Obviously, it's not going to be as heavy and oily as the meat-based ones. This is a kind of vegetarian ramen here. And you can see that the oil is a lot more light and clear. Specifically because there's no animal fats, of course, used in the vegetarian broth. There's going to be some kind of oil added to the soup. So that's that. And then, so the next component that's going to make up the soup is what we call tare, which literally just means like sauce, basically, in Japanese. Usually you see tare used as like a dipping sauce. In the case of ramen, it's going to be like a little bit of sauce, which is added to the bowl before the broth is added. And then they're mixed together, and then the noodles are put in the bowl. And you might wonder why not just mix it into the broth from the start. It's because there's heat sensitive flavors in the tare. And if you boiled it for that long, those flavors might disappear. So they're kind of mixed at the last moment. Usually every shop is going to have its own secret tare recipe. They're going to be a lot of things added in there. Like we said before, like maybe some ginger, maybe some negi or onions, soy sauce, maybe even a little bit of broth added into the tare as well. But usually it's kind of kept secret. But there's three kind of main categories you can break the tare into for ramen. The first one, and this is the first one that appeared in Japan once ramen started getting, Japanized, if you can say, is shoyu, which just means soy sauce. And like we were talking about earlier, one of the reasons that soy sauce became so popular as a flavoring agent for ramen soup is because, at the time, the Japanese palate was not used to so much heavy meat kind of flavors. So the soy sauce kind of, softened the heavy meat flavors a little bit and made it a little bit more palatable. And it still exists as the most common kind of, not necessarily most common, the most basic, I guess you could say, the most basic kind of Japanese ramen today in Japan. Another one is shio, and that just means salt. And shio tare is not going to be so much adding a new kind of flavor, it's just going to be bringing out the flavor of the broth. So that might be a good one to choose if you like something that's more, doesn't have so much strong kind of additive flavors. You just want to really enjoy the basic flavors of the broth, or just like the noodles, itself. And then the other one, and this is the most recent invention, is miso. You've probably heard of miso soup, but other than just miso soup, miso itself is just a kind of fermented paste, basically, usually made from soybeans. It can be made from other things as well. Any kind of very high protein, food can actually be made into miso, actually, but usually made out of soybeans. And there's a lot of variety in what miso you can kind of have based on how you make it, what you use to make it, how long you ferment it for. You can see here there's two very different colors, and the flavor can also vary greatly. We could give a whole presentation just on miso, so won't get into too much depth there. But so miso ramen was the most kind of recent new kind of tare flavor to use for ramen. Okay, and then the next, so when you have the bowl, first you make the broth, and then you put the tare in the bowl, then you pour in the broth, and then you pour in the noodles. So what makes ramen noodles different than other kind of noodles? For example, you also have udon noodles in Japan, which are also another kind of wheat noodles. Their ramen noodles are very basic as far as what they're made out of. It's going to be flour, salt, water, of course, and then kind of the distinguishing factor is something called kansui. And basically what that is just mineral water. It's water with a high amount of potassium carbonate or sodium carbonate. And in the old days, it was actually, they said in Mongolia actually, where these kind of noodles are first made, that was a kind of mineral water that actually flowed freely from like the springs there. And then that's how this unique kind of noodle started getting made. Now, of course, it's commercially available. You can even buy it in powdered form. And it's what gives, first of all, it gives ramen noodles their kind of yellowish color, and it also gives them their firm consistency so they can stand up in that really hot broth without getting too soft and soggy. So that's kind of a typical example of ramen noodles you see there. It got yellow, kind of got the wavy one. There are some different varieties, which we will talk about. And they're boiled separately. They're not boiled in the broth, and then you're boiled separately, and then you kind of shake it out with a strainer, like you see here. Get the water out of there, and then you put it into the soup once the soup is all done in the bowl in which you'll eat it. Next, of course, is toppings. Lots of different toppings, and there's some obvious ones like egg. Of course, you know what an egg is, but there's some you might see and you're not sure what it is if it's written, because a lot of the menu times will be written in Japanese. So kind of go over what those are, just so you know. First is chashu. It's kind of the most popular, I guess you could say, ramen topping, and what that is it's just braised pork, basically pork belly. Very extremely tender, very soft, kind of melt in your mouth kind of pork. This example obviously has a huge amount on there. This is a style of ramen called Hakata Ramen from Fukushima Prefecture, which is known for having a lot of chashu. It doesn't always have this much, but usually it'll be, unless it's vegetarian, you're going to have a slice or two of chashu in the bowl. Another common one is minma, which is fermented bamboo. Looks like this basically. Doesn't really have too much flavor, kind of maybe got a little kind of tangy flavor, but it's really just added more for texture, to add some different texture to the noodles. Kind of got a springy, sort of chewy kind of texture, and that's a nice contrast with the noodles. So that's another very popular ramen topping. Another one you often is negi, and that just means onion basically. Onion not in the sense of like a bulb onion, but like scallions or leeks. Usually scallions is what that's going to mean, and often kind of chopped to look like this. They're going to have the white part, and that's a really usually some will have it on the ramen already, but often you'll be able to choose it from the menu as like negi, like they'll have miso ramen. You'll be able to also choose negi miso ramen, for example, as an option. It'll come with a lot of onion on it, negi, just like that. Also, moyashi is a very popular ramen topping, and that's bean sprouts, soybean sprouts specifically. And like you see here, there's some styles of ramen where the moyashi is served in kind of a giant mountain on top of the ramen. Not necessarily always that much, but that is a kind of popular thing. Have these huge mountains of bean sprouts in the ramen. Add some nice crunch. Once again, they don't have too strong a flavor. It's more of a textural variation is kind of the point of those. And nori, of course, which you probably already know from sushi, if you don't know it from ramen, which is just a different kind of seaweed than the kombu we were talking about earlier. Yeah. And once again, don't always have that much on there. There's actually some ramen under that bowl, but usually it's pretty common to have one kind of a sheet of nori stuck into the side of the bowl. And you can also, it doesn't always come with it, but usually you can add it as an optional topping. Very salty, crunchy, and delicious. I usually like to add it myself. And yeah, Naruto, not the famous manga. It's a topping which is basically like a little slice of like fish sausage, basically. It's kind of a processed fish, and it has a very kind of mild, sort of fishy flavor. Usually there's just gonna be like one slice in the ramen. You're not gonna see like tons of Naruto in the ramen. It's almost kind of as much a visual additive as it is flavor, because it kind of looks interesting there with the there it is, that thing right there, with the kind of the red and or pink and white swirl. Okay, so that's the basic building blocks of ramen we went through there. Next, I'm going to talk about some different regional variations, together with some information about those cities itself. So, while learning about the ramen there, maybe you can also consider that you would like to visit there, and also even some information about how to get there as well. So first, we'll talk about the basic, if you will, kind of Japanese ramen, Tokyo, and then also kind of go down south to Japan's southern island of Kyushu for the kind of ramen that's popular in Fukuoka, and then go up to the northern part of Japan and talk about the ramen in Sapporo. And as you can see from this map, a lot of people imagine Japan as this like tiny little island, but as you can see here, it's actually pretty much the same distance as the east coast of the USA. So pretty serious distances there. Okay, so Tokyo. First, like I said, be given a little bit of information about each city itself. I think Tokyo hardly needs any introduction. Pretty much anyone that visits Japan is going to go there. A lot of you have probably been there as well. So some things you can see in Tokyo, of course, there's Sensoji, which is I believe, the oldest Buddhist temple in Tokyo, certainly the biggest and most spectacular. This is a picture. This is Akihabara, which you've probably heard of. It's famous for, it has a lot of like anime, manga, video game goods, also a lot of electronics. This is the Shibuya Scramble crossing, most highly used pedestrian crossing in the world, I believe. And also you can see sumo in Tokyo is one cool thing you can do there. Depending on the type of year, the time of year, you can also see it in Fukuoka as well, the next city that we'll talk about. So next to get into the ramen, so the Tokyo style of ramen. So Tokyo ramen is the most basic style. It's the basis of Japanese ramen, basically, upon which the other variations we'll discuss are, well, yeah, they're that exactly, variations. So what are the qualities of it? So the soup, typically chicken, might have some pork in there. Niboshi, those sardines, those dried sardines we talked about, are also often an additive in Tokyo style ramen as well. And the typical Tokyo style is shoyu with soy sauce flavor. And of course, it goes without saying that with Tokyo being the major cosmopolitan city that it is, you can in fact eat any kind of ramen there if you want to, including just pretty much any kind of food that exists in the world. But there's the typical traditional Tokyo style is that shoyu soy sauce flavor. The noodles, once again, are kind of straight down the line, just got a medium of thickness and the wavy ones. And typical toppings, once again, nothing too crazy usually for the Tokyo style. Got the chashu, min, which is those bamboo, negi, the onions, and the naruto, that little swirly thing. So yeah, just kind of the most basic form of ramen, Japanese style ramen. And so here's a picture of it. As you can see, it's got that nice shoyu soup. It's got that deep color to it. Not pretty clear, not going to be too cloudy or too thick. And the noodles also are medium thickness as well, and got those toppings, exactly the ones we talked about, are on there. So that's the basics of Tokyo ramen. So next, we're going to kind of go south and try out Fukuoka ramen. So Fukuoka there's a picture of it, kind of got a seaside city, very nice place. And just briefly going through what you can do there. So it's famous for its festivals is one thing. The most popular one is probably the Hakata Yamakasa Festival. And that takes place in the first half of July. Kind of the culmination, I believe, is on the last day of it, July 15th. And what happens is they have these huge floats, which each neighborhood has like their own representative float, and they're raced throughout the city, which is quite a spectacle, as you can imagine. Extremely popular festival that a lot of people come to see. Also, another popular one is the Hakata Dontaku Festival, and that happens in May. And the tradition of that is that was originally the day when all of like the samurai from Fukuoka would make like a procession to go pay tribute to kind of the most high level shogun in the city. And then all the commoners also kind of follow them, and it kind of became a big celebration. And it ended up just being a parade where, a lot of people, wear lots of kinds of different traditional clothing and do kind of performances and just parade around the streets. So that's another really popular festival in Fukuoka. And by the way, the name you see there, Hakata, the ramen we'll also see is also called Hakata Ramen. That was originally a different city from Fukuoka. Hakata and Fukuoka were two different cities, but they merged. So you'll often see kind of Hakata and Fukuoka used sort of interchangeably. Another really big thing in Fukuoka is these yatai is what they're called in Japanese, which is basically just food stalls. We don't see this so much in other cities in Japan, but it's a really big deal in Fukuoka, and they're typically open year-round, and you can all try a lot of different kinds of street food, many of them being local specialties. There's a lot of different local specialties in Fukuoka. Of course, we don't have time to get into all of them, but ramen, of course, being one of them. And it's a great place to try the Fukuoka style of ramen. And you can see from the inside, there's kind of these little, kind of bar style seatings where you can just order food directly. There's a lot of them all adjacent to each other, so you can try a lot of different kinds of food. And definitely one of the big attractions if you're going to be visiting Fukuoka. Another thing, if you want to take a short day trip, there's a city right next to it called Dazaifu, which has a lot of historical stuff. Being that it's the Kyushu island where Fukuoka is located is on the southern part of Japan. It's actually really close to Taiwan. And it was kind of a gateway where Chinese culture entered into Japan. So specifically this temple you see here, which is Shokufukuji Temple, this was the first Zen temple in Japan. And it's kind of got the architecture is a little bit Chinese style as well. So you can kind of see some interesting cultural fusion there. Also, this is a really famous shrine that a lot of people visit. It's called the Dazaifu Tenmangu Shrine. It's dedicated to God of learning, so a lot of students go there to pray for success on their exams and stuff like that. So that's some information about Fukuoka, why you might like visiting it. The biggest reason, of course, is because you want to try the ramen there, which is called Hakata Ramen. Because like we discussed, Hakata was a different place, but now they're kind of merged together. So Hakata Ramen kind of emerged. There's some debate about when exactly and what shop was the first to do it, but it first emerged sometime in the 50s, it appears. And really the first distinguishing thing is got a really rich pork bone base, which is called tonkotsu, which literally just means pork bone. And it's kind of boiled, so it gets this really almost like milky consistency, which has a really deep flavor, strong smell as well, which some people don't like it. Some people do. You can often tell if you're passing a tonkotsu ramen place, way before you enter, because the smell is going out across the whole street. And those are boiled for days to get all that flavor out of the pork bones. The noodles, they're thinner than a lot of the other types we'll see, and they're straight. They're not wavy. So thin, straight noodles is one other way to identify the Hakata Ramen style. And they're cooked to still be, firm in the center. And then as far as typical toppings, a lot of times the toppings are quite simple on there. Just the negi, the onion, the chashu, that braised pork. Sometimes they'll have like serve yourself kind of toppings also. Sometimes they come in the soup, but like benishoga, which is a kind of pickled ginger, or takana, which is pickled mustard leaf. And those are specifically there to kind of rein in that super strong pork flavor and scent if you're someone who can't handle the extreme porkiness of the Hakata noodles. But, you don't want to go too crazy with those because they're just kind of meant to be added sparingly, and try it as it is first before you go too crazy with the toppings, because they're just meant to kind of adjust the flavor if necessary. And that's the benishoga, and that's the takana. There's other ones as well, like sesame seeds, etc., which can be added on. Yeah, so there's a picture of the Hakata Ramen. So you can see there, it's kind of got that, it's shining with just the level of oil from the fat from the pork, and collagen also. A lot of it is all boiled off the bone, and it's all there in the soup. You can see it's not as, if you've had like a lot of tonkotsu ramen in the US, you might notice that the Hakata style actually is a little bit more clear than some of the tonkotsu you can get in the US. And that's because what's often eaten as tonkotsu ramen in the US is actually closer to something called kurume ramen in Japan, which is a different city in Kyushu, which is known for more cloudy, more rich kind of soup. So the Hakata Ramen, while having that really strong pork flavor, still has a little bit more of a clear soup than what you might see at some places. And you can see here, it's got that really thin noodles. This has a very milky soup. So that's all just from that pork bone being boiled. And you can see got some benishoga there in the middle as well. One other cool tradition for Hakata Ramen is called kaidama. And that's just like a refill of noodles, basically. You don't see that so much in other styles of ramen as much as in Hakata, though some have adapted it, but it kind of originated there. And basically it's just a refill of noodles. So say you finish all your noodles, you got some soup left, and you want to eat more, you can order a kaidama, which means that means like a change of a new change of a ball, basically, which because the noodles come in a ball. And but depending on the shop, it can be free. Sometimes they'll give you one or two just as a free service. Sometimes it costs, but it might just be like 100 yen or so, usually not too expensive. So if you're trying Hakata Ramen, take advantage of that and try to get that kaidama. So next, that all looks good. You decide you want to go there. What's the best way to get to Fukuoka, being that it is so, far away from Tokyo relatively? So, the big question is usually, is it better to go by train or by plane? You probably know that the JR Pass is really popular for getting around Japan. That stands for Japan Rail Pass. Gives you unlimited rides on the train. So most people buy that, and they're hesitant to take a plane because it's like, I got the JR Pass, I can ride the train unlimited. And for getting to places like Kyoto or Osaka, even Hiroshima, maybe somewhere that's on the same main island as Tokyo, it's great. But once you get farther away, like to Kyushu, where Fukuoka is, or Hokkaido, where Sapporo is, which we'll be talking about, then plane might be something you might want to consider. So if you go without the JR Pass, it's going to be 23,000 yen, around 217 US dollars. And it takes about 5 hours. And if you use the JR Pass, of course, it's free. You can get on unlimited bullet train rides. It takes a little bit longer because you can't use the express train on some of the lines with the JR Pass. So it takes about 6 hours to get to Fukuoka from Tokyo. So if you take a plane, it's about a 2-hour flight. And, if you buy the full fare, it can be like $400 or so expensive. But if you're a foreign visitor holding a round-trip international ticket, the Japanese airlines, All Nippon and Japan Airlines, have these special deals for foreigners, where you can get each leg of the flight for around $100. So pretty good deal, time-saving. So it might be something you'd want to consider, especially since time is so valuable when you're on your trip. Okay, so that's Fukuoka. Next, we'll be moving up north to Sapporo. Very nice place, and I used to live there myself, actually. So as you can see here, it's kind of got a more grid style structure than in some Japanese cities. That's because it's more recent. The island of Hokkaido was really only fully settled by Japanese in the 19th century. And in fact, for a lot of their city planning, they used American cities as kind of the blueprint, sort of, for their city planning. So it's kind of got a more Western kind of feel in that way. As far as what Sapporo is famous for, being up in the north, gets massive, massive amounts of snowfall. And every February, there's something called the Yuki Matsuri, or the Snow Festival, where basically you have these enormous sculptures made out of snow. You can see one here. If you can't tell from the picture, that's like almost like life size. It's huge, and it's made completely out of snow. They also have like smaller ones like this, which are also really interesting. And then in other parts of the city too, they have like an ice version of the Snow Festival. Lots of ice sculptures you can see. So that happens every year in February. So that's definitely a cool time to visit Sapporo. You've probably also heard of Sapporo beer. It is obviously internationally known. Goes great with ramen, of course, too. And the old factory where they used to make Sapporo beer has now been made into a museum. So you can go visit the Sapporo Beer Museum and, of course, try drinking some beer samples as well. And it's also really famous for its nightlife. This is an area called Susukino. Lots of places to like eat and drink and stuff open really late into the night. It's kind of the biggest nightlife district outside of Tokyo is in Sapporo. Also, great for winter sports. They have amazing snow up there for skiing, really good powder snow. And both within Sapporo city itself, like the place you see here, also if you take a day trip outside of Sapporo, or even a kind of an overnight trip for a few nights, lots of amazing places to ski up in Hokkaido. So that's also a draw to go up and visit there. Also, as a day trip from Sapporo, there's a really nice place called Otaru, just about a 40 or so minute train ride away. Got some nice historical warehouses there, and you can't see in this picture, but it's a seaside city. So really beautiful place to visit, nice day trip. And if we're going to talk about ramen in Sapporo, we also have to mention the Ramen Yokocho, which means ramen alley, literally. And it's just a tiny little alley with nothing but ramen shops where you can go and sample some of the Sapporo style of ramen, which now we will talk about. So what are the qualities of Sapporo ramen? So there's an origin how it appeared, and one is that you might think, okay, well, miso soup, because Sapporo ramen is miso ramen. Did they just put noodles in the miso soup? Well, it's a little bit different. There's actually one theory about how it started. Is there's a soup called tonjiru, which just means like pork soup, basically, literally, and it does feature a lot of miso, also pork fat. And is that someone tried putting noodles into the soup, and it became miso ramen, which became the popular type of ramen in Sapporo, is one theory about how it evolved. In any case, miso ramen was by far the most kind of popular ramen in Sapporo by the 1950s. And so the soup is typically got a pork base, often have lard in there, and the tare, that sauce that we talked about, is going to be miso based. It's going to have some miso, a lot of miso in there. And it's really perfect for the cold climate up north there because it's so rich and heavy and nourishing. Good to keep you, nice and warm when it's going to be so cold. The noodles also are appropriately, they're very thick noodles, kind of the opposite of those Hakata ones we talked about. And wavy is the Sapporo style. And as far as toppings, you got the typical ones, the chashu, the minma, bamboo, negi, the onion. Also, one kind of unique thing in Sapporo ramen is you'll often see stir-fried vegetables added, such as onion, like the actual, the normal bulb onion, or a cabbage, are often stir-fried and added onto the soup. Also, local Hokkaido delicacies, such as corn, a lot of corn is grown up there, is added, as well as butter, because dairy is a big thing up there. And once again, so you might think like it's got lard and the pork bone and the butter, a lot of fat and oil, but it's very good. So got a big old thing of butter on there, like you can see there. So you can definitely not mistake that as a bowl of Sapporo ramen. And you can also see the soup has that kind of cloudy miso, unlike the white Hakata soup. This has a cloudy, miso kind of color to it, which gives it a nice salty, rich, really deep umami flavor. And some places will even have seafood included, because seafood is also a famous thing in Hokkaido. Specifically, this one has crab and scallop. Crab is kind of more rare. I haven't seen that so much, but scallop, that's a thing you'll see sometimes included in Sapporo ramen. So next, how to get to Sapporo. Once again, train versus plane. And it's pretty much the exact same situation we discussed with Fukuoka, where it's kind of a time versus money thing, assuming you get the JR pass. With Sapporo, it's even more pronounced, because even they did come out with the Hokkaido bullet train a few years ago, but it still takes 8 hours from Tokyo to Sapporo. If you're just going to go straight there, very long train ride. And if you have no JR pass, it's going to set you back like $275. If you have a JR pass, it's free. So it may be an option if you're going to be like going up there and going to some other northern cities as well, maybe going up there little by little. That could be an option. But if you're going straight from Tokyo, I would say just take a flight. It's about a 90-minute flight, and once again, have those special deals, which you can get for about $100 or so. So quite convenient, actually, getting from Tokyo to Sapporo. And they have lots of flights a day. Very convenient for timing as well. So that's all about those different Japanese cities. Next, I want to talk about some ramen you can try in Atlanta. There's one specific place I want to recommend in Sandy Springs specifically, which might kind of be a giveaway. That's what I'm talking about. So it's actually recognized in the 2019 Michelin Guide, and it specializes in a kind of ramen we haven't talked about yet, which is tsukemen. And that just means that the noodles and the soup come out separately, and you dip the noodles in the soup as you eat it. So you can try that at this place, and it is Okiboru. Some of you may have tried it. Very good place if you're now in the mood for ramen. So maybe you can give them a call. They have there's that skimming we talked about. So you can see, like, they, rather than have the noodles in the soup, you dip them as you eat. And specifically, this menu item they have, this is called buta paitan skimming. And buta just means pork, so it's a pork bone-based soup. Paitan literally just means like a white soup, but it's not white, of course. But it just means like a cloudy, deep soup. The not the clear type, which you can see it is here. They also have some traditional ramen dishes as well, not just the skimming. This one is called the truffle chintan ramen, and it's flavored with truffles actually, so it's got that really deep truffle flavor. And the chintan, that just means a clear soup. So it's it's not that like the tonkotsu kind of style where it's all cloudy. It's the clear, more light kind of soup where the flavor is going to kind of come out more clearly. And if you want to visit, there is their contact info, so feel free to screenshot that if you want to. They're open for takeout and delivery, I understand. So good place to try. So thank you very much for listening. That's all. That was a lot of information in a short time. Hope it was not too boring. Thank you, everybody.